Welcome to Ministries That Podcast, where I talk to successful ministry leaders about how they're using podcasting to amplify their mission and grow their ministry so you can too. I'm Tim Hull, your host and owner of Sonomorphic, a podcast production company that specializes in podcasting for ministries. My guest today is Jeff Brown. He's the host of Read to Lead podcast, as well as an author, mentor, and speaker. Jeff and I are going to talk about his 11-year journey in podcasting, how he's had to adapt to the ever-changing and growing podcast industry, his monetization strategy with multiple revenue streams, and the essential tools he uses to produce his podcast. So let's get right to it. Here's my conversation with Jeff Brown. Well, Jeff, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Well, thank you for having me. I haven't done this in a little while, and I'm excited.
Yeah. So I think I first heard about your podcast, Read to Lead, early on, back when I worked at Ramsey Solutions and was the producer of the Entre Leadership podcast. And we were both interviewing authors frequently of new books that were coming out. And so I frequently would jump over to your podcast and see who you were interviewing. And then later on, we crossed paths in a guys group that some friends had put together and just hung out in some backyards and had a good time. And then we got lunch and talked about podcasting and how you have everything set up around your business. And so that was a lot of fun. That was a few years ago now. And so I recently listened to your latest episode and saw that you have been podcasting for now 11 years. So I wanted to jump on the podcast and talk with you about your journey over that time. To kind of get started, if people go to your podcast and look at the description, they might be thinking, hey, Tim, Jeff isn't a ministry podcast. Read to Lead is about interviewing business leaders and leadership experts and personal development experts. But if you go back and listen to the trailer episode, if you haven't listened to the trailer episode, I specifically stated, I'm defining ministry as a work that a person or organization does to serve people and glorify God. And Jeff is doing exactly that. So I wanted to have him on the podcast to talk with him about his journey. So we'll get into the faith side of things a little bit later. But first, I want to just jump into the beginning of your journey in podcasting. What led you to starting the Read to Lead podcast back in July of 2013?
Yeah, I developed a love of reading. I had a love of reading as a child, and school sort of educated that desire out of me, as school sometimes does. I left school not wanting to read anymore. I was done with books. I was done with writing even. Those things just bored me to tears in school. So for the better part of 10 years, I didn't do much of either of those things. I wasn't reading for personal and professional development. I wasn't reading much at all unless it was a magazine article or something like that. An occasional newspaper. This was, again, a while ago. People still read the newspaper. My career had sort of become stagnant, my radio career at the time, and I managed to land at a company in Nashville called Way FM that had a guy at the helm at the time who had a love for books and business books, and he brought those into the workplace, and I would often, catch him reading. And I remember early on thinking, man, he's like goofing off. He's not working. He's reading. What is he thinking he's doing? I didn't know what he was reading. I just thought, well, that's not the way to spend your day. Through a series of events and circumstances, I realized what he was reading. I started asking him questions about what he was reading, and he began bringing those books into meetings and talking about them. And we started a little book club. And the very first book I remember being introduced to was Purple Cow by Seth Godin. And I just ate that up. I just thought, wow, this is fantastic. This is fascinating. I'm learning something, and this is stuff I need to know for my job and to be better at what I do. And I thought, well, what else is there? And I started reading more, and this sort of flame that had died out was rekindled. Here I am in my early 30s. And so, that was maybe 2003 or something like that.
Okay.
I would go on to see my career just skyrocket. I had like 6 promotions in 12 years. And I attribute a lot of that, Tim, to the reading that I was doing. Just by nature of the fact I was doing that, I was doing something that most people weren't doing, and that gave me an advantage, an edge in my career, and allowed me to do a lot of things I wouldn't have otherwise been able to do. And so I had kicked around, back to your question, the idea of doing a podcast for like 5 years. I started thinking about it in 2008, but I thought, well, what would I do a podcast about? One day on the way home from work, it just hit me. I was sort of counting up the books I had read so far that year. This was like in March, and I had read like 10 or 12 books. And I had this sort of light bulb epiphany moment where it was like, that's like a book a week. I didn't realize I was reading a book a week. That's
Yeah.
like a book a week. And that light bulb epiphany moment was, wait a minute, maybe that's the podcast I should be doing. I'm already reading a book a week anyway. I kind of thought of podcasts as weekly events. They're not all weekly, obviously, but that's kind of the ones I listened to were. None of them that I listened to at the time were interview-based. I was so naive about the industry at the time. I remember thinking, gee, I wonder if anybody else is doing an interview-based podcast. That's how naive I was. And of course, I did some research and realized, well, that's most of them. And I even thought about putting that idea aside. I thought, well, somebody's already doing an interview-based podcast. Can I do an interview-based? I mean, that's how naive I was. But I decided to go through with it anyway. And this is now, this is early 2013. I had the idea in March. I start, researching and doing things of that nature. Decided I'm going to pull the trigger. I buy the equipment that I need. I start reaching out to guests. And in July 2023, I launched. Now, the funny thing about all that is a month before I launched, that job where my career had skyrocketed for 12 or 13 years ended. And there was some sort of a day of downsizing. They call it Black Monday now. 3 of us and this small local staff, the local staff, not the network staff, but the local staff were let go. And I was one of those people. And so here I was already well into planning this podcast, and I decided to go ahead and go through with it. I didn't have to worry anymore about, taking off during my lunch hour to go do an interview and then come back to work anymore. I didn't have a job. So the podcast started a month after that happened. I've been doing it ever since. Yeah, it's just started with this love of reading and decided that this is something more people need to be doing, and maybe I can help them more easily access books or consume books if they're not going to actually sit down and read them. Maybe here's sort of an audio Cliff's Notes they could interact with.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a fantastic idea. And you've been doing it now for 11 years. And so I'd love to hear, you were mentioning your radio career. How did that experience play into you getting into podcasting? What were some of the advantages that you had because you had that background?
I didn't think of them that much at the time, but some of them were the fact that I'd been interviewing people at the time the podcast started for 26 years. Most of the people doing interview-based podcasts then and now, the only experience they have interviewing is when they started their podcast. And so I'd been doing it for a quarter of a century. And so I think I had an advantage there. I'd earned a living behind a microphone for, again, at that time, 26 years. And so it was just a very natural transition, even just to how I set up my episodes and the way I partitioned everything and how I did what I did came to me naturally because I'd been doing it for so long. And it's funny you asked that question because about 6 months into my journey, I began having people ask me to teach them some of the things that I was doing. Again, I didn't think were worthy of being taught because I was so used to and so sort of the curse of knowledge kind of a thing. I'd been doing it for so long. I thought, well, this isn't magic. This is easy, but the things that come naturally to you are magic to other people, and so I had to sort of reckon with that, reverse engineered the process of how I put a podcast together. I looked at, well, what did I do? I just did it naturally, but what did I really do? And I reverse engineered that and created a framework and began being asked to speak about that. And I've spoken on podcast interviewing in particular dozens and dozens of times. So that's probably the biggest advantage for me, I think, doing an interview-based podcast. And I think that helped me stand out in a lot of ways just because I had that experience. And like I said, just being comfortable behind a microphone, understanding how to get a listener's attention and keep it, how to sort of get rid of all the fluff, that sort of thing. So those were some of the advantages that I think being in radio for so long helped me with.
Yeah. With that experience, you've been a follower of Jesus, and we were talking about at the beginning, most of the people that are on ministries that podcast are ministry leaders, but not everybody is overtly a ministry. And so I would love to know too, how has being a follower of Jesus impacted your podcast in that journey over the past decade?
First and foremost, I hope people look at what I do and they sense that I approach what I do with excellence. Mm-hmm. And to me, that's one of the most important aspects about what I do is I believe that if we're going to ask people to come join us for this journey called a podcast episode, we need to respect people's time. I think that's one of the most important things as a podcaster is to respect people's time. And that begins with doing what you do with intentionality and with excellence. And so, there's a lot of people in a lot of different fields who are Christians, who are seen as followers of the mainstream and followers of the secular world. I don't want to be that. I want to be a leader in this space who happens to be a Christian, and a leader in large part because I take what I do seriously and I do it with excellence, and I do it with excellence because I've been doing it for a long time. And so there's certainly been specific episodes where I've talked about my faith with a guest, or they were a believer and we've got into the conversation of how their faith impacts what they do. And so for listeners who have been around for a while, they've heard me talk about some of those things in specific episodes. But apart from that, I try to just live out my life as best I can in the content I create with as much excellence as I can put into it and let it speak for itself.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I'd love to hear too, now that you've been doing this for over a decade, what are some of the ways, because podcasting has changed so much even in the recent years, what are some ways that you've had to adapt as the podcast industry has grown over the past 11 years?
I think the core principles of providing valuable content and building a loyal audience have remained the same.
Yeah.
One of the things that have changed is, social media is always evolving. Video content has become more and more important, though I've gone into that kicking and screaming. I'm just, a radio guy at heart. I record video for all my episodes, but I don't always utilize it. I don't always use it. That's probably, for long term, not a good idea. I'm going to need to, change that eventually. I think add more video to the mix. I've been recording video since episode 400. I'm on episode 536 now. So, I've got a pretty decent library of content, but haven't used a great deal of that. So I don't understand the podcast purists, and you maybe have heard some of these if you've attended any podcast conferences, that believe that a podcast is defined by whether or not it has an RSS feed. Maybe that's your take on it. I don't know. But to me, a podcast is whatever the listener or viewer says it is. So,
when it comes down to it.
If you watch Joe Rogan on YouTube, you're watching Joe's podcast on YouTube. Just because it doesn't have in that particular space an RSS feed doesn't mean it's not a podcast. And so I think as far as how the industry's evolved, to your question, I think that's one major thing that a lot of podcast purists have not reckoned with. They still view podcasting, that's audio at its heart, and that's an RSS feed and all these other things. I think more and more, when I think about the podcasts that I interact with, 90% of them I consume on a 65-inch television in my living room on YouTube. I mean, I've got a podcast app on my phone, and so when I'm traveling, when I'm on the go, I'll use that. But when I'm at home, which for me is more often than not, working from home, that's how I'm interacting with podcasts. And so the video aspect of it especially, and what is a podcast and what isn't, I think are the two major trend changes I've seen that, I think a lot of podcasters still haven't reckoned with.
Yeah. I'm an audio guy as well. And so my bent is towards, I really love the audio medium. But video has exploded so much on the podcasting side, as well as, I can't remember if it was Edison or somebody else that interviewed podcast listeners and how they define a podcast. And it is so blurry of what is a podcast? Is it what you're watching on YouTube? Is it, that aren't actually, they weren't even, the creators of those channels weren't necessarily setting out to start a podcast, but people see it as a podcast. Right. It's a delivery of content and a certain length, and that in people's minds it becomes a podcast. So it is interesting to see how that's developed specifically over just even the past 5 years, I'd say, with a lot of that for sure. Jeff, now that you've been doing it for 11 years, what would you say still makes it worth podcasting?
Well, I think it's worth doing for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is, I hope anyway, the impact that it has on listeners. Hearing from people who've been impacted, their lives or their careers. I just heard from, coincidentally, a pastor just in the last week or two. In fact, I was trying to find his comment this morning. I don't remember where he said it, whether it was in my community or in a private chat or in an email to me. I couldn't find his comments. But the gist of it was him sharing the impact that the podcast has had on him, the interviews that I've done, the courses I've created. And this is somebody who's been following me apparently for a while that I wasn't even aware of until he joined the community recently. That makes my year. I mean, if I don't get another comment like that for the rest of the year, I'm good. just knowing that what this little thing that I'm doing in a spare bedroom in my house can impact a guy who leads a congregation somewhere and is helping him do that better. I mean, that makes the whole 11 years worth it, just hearing that one story. And
Yeah.
there are certainly other stories like that, and many that I'll never know. I mean, I just happen to know this one because he joined my community and shared that somewhere. A lot of people don't do that. A lot of people, are impacted by what we do, what you do, what I do, and they don't ever say anything. So when I hear something like that, it's very encouraging, and it makes it rewarding, and just gives you this desire to want to keep going.
Yeah. Yeah. It's great to get feedback of some nature. And that's why, the ratings and reviews things doesn't necessarily help the ratings on the Apple charts, right? But the way in which it boosts the morale of the podcast host of like, hey, people are listening and they care. Or if you have a community and they're commenting and sharing how it's impacting their life is huge for those of us that are making the content and putting it out there and hoping that people are enjoying it and assuming that people are enjoying it unless people are saying otherwise. But that's why I really appreciate when people leave reviews. So in what ways has podcasting led to other opportunities that are outside of the podcasting industry that you don't think that you necessarily would have had if you didn't have a podcast?
Oh, yeah, those are many. The first thing that comes to mind is speaking engagements that I've done, the chance to get up in front of hundreds of people and talk about leadership, talk about personal and professional development, talk about reading. And so it's opened many, many doors for that. People who wouldn't have known I existed otherwise. Probably the biggest is a book deal. I had a book come out almost 3 years ago now, named after the podcast, traditionally published book. That never would have happened without the podcast, certainly. And that is something that I've dreamed about, publishing a book for decades. That even when I started the podcast, it wasn't on my radar I'm going to start this podcast and this podcast is going to lead to a book deal. That was the furthest thing from my mind. But to have that dream realized as a result of what I was doing over here on the side, it still, baffles me the way these things happen. These dreams that you've let die that actually come to life sort of out of nowhere just because you're just doing what you love, And so that's probably been the biggest thing. And it's collaboration with, many industry leaders. And each podcast episode for me is sort of a collaboration or an opportunity to be coached by somebody who's doing work that I admire. My network has grown exponentially, like the chance to publish a book, get in front of audiences and speak. All those are things that I enjoy immensely, relationships, speaking, writing. And so the podcast has helped all of those things happen in spades.
Yeah, that's great. So what would you say are some of the key ways that podcasting has helped amplify the work that you're doing? I usually say amplify your mission and grow your ministry, but, encompassing all of the things that you're doing, what are some of the ways that podcasting has helped you just level that up?
Well, it's allowed me to reach a global audience and amplify my mission that way. My mission being promoting personal and professional growth through reading. I remember early on realizing that the podcast was being downloaded. I haven't looked at this stat in forever, but it was something like 150 countries or 135 countries or something like that. And I was like, oh my goodness. And there might be some countries where it's had 5 downloads. I don't know.
Yeah, sure.
But to see that and to think, wow, I spent all that time in radio. I had listeners at parts of my career all over the country. To make that happen meant, driving 45 minutes to work every day and sitting in a studio that somebody else built that cost, a few $100,000 or millions of dollars. And then that content had to go to a tower that then transmitted it to, all these millions of dollars in investment that went into enable me to be heard by people initially or for a long period of my career in a single community and eventually nationally. But then I could leave that and come to my house in, 2013 and through just a few $100s in equipment broadcast to the world. The wonders of the internet, right?
Yep.
And so when I think about that dichotomy, whatever you want to call it, it just amazes me that, if you'd told me when my radio career started that I'd be reaching far more people from my house one day than radio could ever help me reach. Not that radio can't help people have global reach. But boy, it's sure more cost effective doing it this way. I can tell you that, and a lot easier. And not to have to be, this is going to sound negative. I don't mean it to sound negative, but when I look at the radio people who have transitioned to podcasting, and of course I'm one of those, one of the things I appreciate about this medium and sort of the time shift that's involved is I'm not tied to a studio 4 or 5 hours every day, 5 days a week. That's just how it is. If you're going to do that other thing, that's how it's done. But the freedom that I have now to do what I do and to be able to do it when I want to do it, week to week to week, to me has been liberating. And so the global reach my podcast has allowed has been mind-boggling. I thought there would, for decades, there'd have to be gatekeepers involved in all of this. But it's provided a platform, as I said earlier, to discuss, values and principles that align with my faith, serving as a form of ministry by inspiring and helping other people.
So you're mentioning, the difference in how working in radio is costing hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars, and then now you're in a spare bedroom with a few $100s worth of gear. So I'd love to get into some of the technical and production side of things. What gear did you start using, and how has that changed over time?
Yeah, I started with a Mackie mixer, 1402.VLZ4, I think. High LPR40 microphone, the one that you see here. An iMac, Adobe Audition. I started my interviews using Skype. Most of that has remained unchanged. I have the same mic I started with 11 years ago. That Mackie 1402 is sitting right here. I'm on it right now. I'm on my second iMac. I went from using Skype to, I did Riverside for a while, and I've been using Zoom for a couple of years. The equipment, the hardware is almost completely unchanged. The software has changed a little bit here and there, but the hardware, I paid about $1,500, $1,600 for what I have, and it's lasted all this time.
Yeah, the PR40 is a great mic, and we had those at Ramsey for a while before it switched over to the SM7s. But
I had a feeling.
Fantastic, fantastic sounding mic. Yeah. I mean, it sounds great on your voice, Jeff. So I think it's a fantastic choice for you for sure. What did podcast hosting look like for you back in 2013 versus now?
Yeah, in 2013, it was pretty much Libsyn and nothing else. And gosh, probably a few dozen alternatives have popped up since then, maybe hundreds. I don't know. I haven't kept up with that. I am one of those folks who still use Libsyn and have coached a lot of podcast clients over the years using Libsyn and other tools too, but I still use the same tool I started with all those years ago. Some of my colleagues who started around the same time I did with podcasts, I think of people like Jeff Sanders with the 5 a.m. Miracle podcast, started a couple of weeks, I think, before my podcast did. I think he's changed hosts 2 or 3 times. I've changed artwork a few times and changed music themes a few times, but my host has remained the same these entire 11 years.
Gotcha. Yeah. So what made you, over time, things change with the album artwork and you want to refresh it? What were those kind of breakpoints of like, hey, I should probably update this?
Yeah, with the artwork, I was about 5.5 years into my show or something like that, and I just felt like it had gotten stale, and I was getting ready to launch an online summit where I had like 30 some odd speakers to speak on the topic of going boss free, of leaving your 9 to 5 and doing your own thing. Because I was launching that and working on that, I thought, now's a good time to update the artwork and put literally a new face on it. My face wasn't on the artwork originally, as it is now. As far as music themes, I don't know if you asked about that specifically, but I remember I've probably gone years between music themes. I think I've had 3 or 4. And it's a very small part of the podcast. I mean, you hear it for a minute or two at the beginning and you hear it a minute or two at the end, and that's it. But I remember reading a review of my podcast, and it was a positive review overall, but then the last sentence was something like, but that music theme is really unfortunate. And I remember thinking, well, it's been a few years, 2 or 3 years. It's probably time I update that and change it. So that review prompted me to make a change.
Gotcha, yeah.
And that next one was like sort of dubstep kind
Mm.
of a theme, and that kind of got, sort of worn out its welcome pretty
Mm.
quickly. And then the one I have now, I've actually been using for about 3.5, almost 4 years. I think it was
Okay.
2020 when I started using the one I have now. But yeah, I just get tired of them after a while and decide, oh, it's time for a change. There's no
Yeah.
forethought. There's no strategy in that for me. Maybe there is for some people, but I just kind of go with what I think sounds good until I feel like it doesn't anymore.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. There's a lot more that goes into podcasting, obviously, than just the gear that sits in front of you. What would you say are some of the essential tools that you use to produce your podcast?
I've been a fan of Adobe Audition. It's a tool I used when I was in radio. And
Yeah.
so when I started doing this, it just seemed like the tool I should use since I knew it so well. I use a productivity tool called Milanote, sort of a project-based tool to kind of keep track of all my interviews and what's where. And I've got little Kanban boards, set up inside this tool to kind of remind myself, okay, who's in the batter's box, who's on deck, and what's ready to be edited, what's been published, that sort of thing, and have all the I's been dotted and the T's been crossed with this particular episode and marketed and effectively and all those sorts of things. Again, for editing, Adobe Audition, that's been such a solid tool for me for so long. I'm going back probably, they used to call it Cool Edit years ago before Adobe bought it. But that's how long I've been using it. And then Milanote's been a tool I've only used for probably 3 years. It's been a great tool for projects. So I've got a tool for tasks. I've got a tool for knowledge management, but Milanote is my project management tool. And it's huge for my podcast, but also the community, Read to Lead community that I run online as well.
Yeah, so let's talk about the community for a minute. You go about monetization in a different way than a lot of people do. A lot of people think monetization, podcasting, podcast ads, that's the immediate thought. But you have a community, you have some other avenues. I'd love to hear how you approach monetizing the podcast and how that all works together.
Yeah, great question. I've had probably, I've counted up 11 or 12 different streams of income that I can directly connect to the podcast. The paid community has been one of the more recent ways. That's a monthly fee for people or an annual fee for people who participate in that. And so we're getting together a couple of times a month as a group. I do a monthly AMA, Ask Me Anything, and each month is themed, by the way. And so this month's theme is self-improvement is this month's theme. And so I led an AMA on that. And then we had a guest expert that comes in once a month who speaks on the theme and is usually somebody who's written a book, who is sort of inspiring the theme for that month. Speaking engagements we talked about as a direct result of the podcast, paid speaking. I've created courses over the years. I started out doing a podcast course, even though my listeners weren't necessarily people who wanted to start a podcast. I had enough people asking me to do that. And more recently, I've created courses back going to maybe 2022 is my most recent course called Note Making Mastery. It's just a course about personal knowledge management and how to better collect the information you want to keep, organize it, how to connect new ideas with existing ideas as they come in, how to break down what you're capturing in its simplest form in such a way that it means something to future you, who is the one that's going to need it ultimately. And then how to create, connect, crystallize, and create are sort of the 4 pillars of Note Making Mastery. So there's that aspect of it. I've done podcasts. I mentioned podcast coaching for about 10 years now. So about a year into the process, I started coaching. One of the really cool things there was I had built a relationship with a guy who's done really well for himself in the podcast space by the name of John Lee Dumas. Yeah. And for 10 years, John has consistently sent me clients, has referred clients to me. He saw me, thankfully, as somebody early on who was doing what I was doing in a way that he had admired and appreciated. And when he stopped doing that, he was doing that for a time, he began sending those folks who would come to him for that to, Jeff's the guy that I recommend. So
that's great.
So that's been awesome. And then ads for my own stuff, certainly in my podcast.
Yeah.
One of my biggest advertisers over the years was FreshBooks, cloud accounting software, who we did like a 3-year run with them at one point. SoFi, before they were advertising on the Super Bowl, were advertising on the Read to Lead podcast, and that still blows my mind. And then through Libsyn more recently, I've been using their built-in tool for dynamic insertion to have ads dynamically inserted, in my case, at the beginning and at the end of episodes. Yeah. And so I just got a notification of a deposit in my account today from Libsyn. So those are just some of the ways. Again, I think there's 11 or 12 if I were to just count them all up. But the podcast has led to each and every one of those. Not to mention, the book.
Right.
The year I wrote that, 2020 started, and I decided when 2020 started that I was going to go all in on public speaking and in-person workshops. Workshops is another way I've monetized the podcast. So think about 2020. What happened in March?
Yeah.
And so my decision to go all in on public speaking and in-person workshops was a really dumb idea in hindsight. Well, around March or February is when the book deal happened. And so that sort of saved my income for that because I got an advance to write the book, right? And so there was a treatment, if you will, sort of a sample or a treatment of the kind of book we were going to write, but no book yet. And that's the beauty of the process is, you could get a nice advance and then go write the book. That was huge for that year because the things I'd gone all in on were now not going to happen. So I think people are selling themselves short if they put all their eggs in any one basket, especially if that basket is advertising.
Yeah, so talk a little bit more about that. What are some of the other ways that you've seen? You've listed quite a few. What have you seen to be like the best way for you, at least, besides advertising, that's brought in like a majority of your revenue?
Yeah, that's promoting your own stuff. It's still advertising technically on your show. You're just pointing people to the stuff you've created and that you're selling instead of something that somebody else has created and they're selling. And maybe they've given you, like in the case of FreshBooks, paid me guaranteed money to run ads for them. You might have that kind of relationship with some advertisers. Other advertisers might treat you like an affiliate where you're paid for, leads that you send them kind of a thing, or actual purchasers. But to me, the far better way is to promote your own stuff, is do ads. And I was doing that when my podcast started. When my podcast started, I was doing mobile apps and websites. That was my little boutique business I had started when I lost my job. And that's how I made money. And I remember getting clients from my podcast by promoting my little side business. And I also knew that I eventually wanted, for lack of a better term, legitimate ads in my show. And I didn't want to do a show where, for months or years, there were no ads and then suddenly there were. And so I wanted to condition the listener that from the very beginning, this is a sponsored podcast. So that wouldn't be like a disruption to them, to their ears later. And I think that helped. So when, actual advertisers came, that was just a real easy transition to make. But I've done far more income through the stuff that I've created in promoting that than sponsors.
Yeah. All right. Well, now that you're well over 500 episodes in, what are you most excited about for the next 100 episodes?
I've thought long and hard about this, and I have toyed with the idea of slowing down in the sense that does it still make sense to do an episode every week?
Okay.
That's not exactly what you asked, but when I think of the next 100 episodes, historically you're talking about the next 2 years, right? In my case, with weekly episodes. If I make that change, the next 100 episodes might take a lot longer. And so I'm trying to sort of think of it in those terms. Now, whether or not I do that, I'm not 100% sure. But I know that I'm at a place personally in my life where reading a book a week is not as easy as it once was in many ways, just because of where I'm at in my life. And so there's that aspect of it. But for the interviews that I am going to do, for the podcast episodes I am going to release, I'm particularly excited about two things on either extremes of the book publishing spectrum. I'm excited about those new authors who haven't been discovered yet, who are maybe writing their first book. I think of like the James Clears of the world. When he came on my podcast in 2018, 99% of the world didn't know who James Clear was. I'd met him, sat on a panel with him at a conference a year or two before and knew of his blog and the readership he was building there. But now his books, it's sold 10 million plus copies or whatever, So, but I think about where he was at when he launched that book in 2018 and what a gem that book is. Then the other end of the spectrum, there's people like Seth Godin, John Maxwell, people like that. I've had the privilege of interviewing Seth, I think 3 times for the podcast. And I mentioned his book, Purple Cow, and how it sort of rekindled my love for reading. So that's very special to me. But each of those times I've asked Seth to appear. I just got an email last week from his publicist asking me if he can be on the podcast. It only took 11 years to get there, but we're finally at that place.
That's fantastic. Yeah.
Seth's got a new book coming out, and they're reaching out to me to have him on. So I'm very much looking forward to that in the next few months. He's far and away my favorite author.
Yeah, Seth's great. We had him on the Entre Leadership podcast several times too. And yeah, he's always great to work with. Let's jump into the high pass segment where we ignore the lows and I ask you about some of your favorite things. So the first thing, what's your favorite book to recommend to people?
We mentioned James Clear's Atomic Habits a moment ago. A book that came out a couple of years later on that same topic that I think is way underrated is B.J. Fogg's Tiny Habits. If you enjoyed Atomic Habits, I think you would enjoy Tiny Habits. And it's a very, very practical book. I found it to be, even probably more so than Atomic Habits, very instructive. I mean, Fogg is a professor at Stanford, and so he's a great teacher. I'm not saying James is not by any means, but it's one of those types of books that makes it super, super easy to apply what you're learning. He leaves no stone unturned there. Another book I love is a more recent one written by the guy who wrote a book called Ultra Learning. That was a bestseller, Wall Street Journal bestseller in 2019 or 2020. His name is Scott H. Young. I'm looking at it right now. It's called Get Better at Anything, 12 Maxims for Mastery. I loved Dr. Nate Zinzer's The Confident Mind. He's a West Point guy, has been training cadets out there for years. And it's a book about mindset and how we speak to ourselves and those sorts of topics. So those are three that come to mind. If I were to mention a fourth, I would say Liz Weissman's Multipliers, How the Best Leaders Make Everyone Smarter. That book has been huge, had a huge impact with regard to how I view leadership. Now, that book's almost 20 years old now, I think, and had an impact on me when I was still in the sort of 9-to-5 world. I came from a command and control style of leadership having been taught to me. And her book was instrumental in helping open my eyes to the fact that I was a diminisher type leader that she talks about. And it taught me how to go from being a diminisher type leader to being a multiplier. That's our special book to me as well.
Nice. Yeah. All right. What's your favorite hobby right now?
Probably playing with AI.
Okay.
And seeing all the ways I can leverage AI to make what I do easier, whether that's work-related or what have you. A buddy of mine and I are looking to start a company together. He was asking me to create sort of a one sheet that we could give to potential clients that explain, why you need this service, the services we provide, why you need it, what it looks like, and et cetera. And we had a meeting at a restaurant, and he asked me to if I'd go off and make this. And I go home, and 20 minutes later, I'm sending him the finished thing. And he's like, "Oh my gosh, this is amazing! This is awesome!" And we meet for lunch the next time, and we're talking about it. And he brings that back up. This was incredible. And I opened up my laptop and said, "Let me tell you a secret. Maybe you've heard this thing called AI. There's just stuff like that. I mean, even how I interact with books, and this isn't something that the average person can do because the average person doesn't have access to PDF copies of brand new books, for example. But I often will get sent those. I used to insist on physical copy of a book before I was going to read it because I like being able to hold it and sift through and all that. And now I find that I'm insisting on a PDF copy because what I want to do is I want to upload it to ChatGPT or Notebook LM and then have a conversation with the book. With the author, essentially. And AI allows me to do that rather than reading the book from cover to cover, right? And so I've really enjoyed kind of playing with those things and building sort of, AI chatbots and, messing with all that. So that's been really fascinating. And there's good and bad and everything, and AI is no exception. But I, for one, am bullish about it. We'll see how that goes going forward, I guess.
All right. Well, what's one of your favorite stories from a listener about how the Read to Lead podcast has impacted their life?
There's one person in particular that comes to mind who has been a faithful listener since the very beginning. And there's a handful of people that would fit this, but I'm thinking of one in particular that has probably purchased everything I have ever created, seen me speak, been a member of my paid mastermind. They've done it all. And I once asked them, why? I'm not the only one out there doing stuff related to this. The answer was much what you might expect.
Mm.
And I think a lot of us lose sight of this. And I struggled with this in starting my podcast and the courses I've created and the other things that I've done. It's like, I'm not the only one doing this. What makes me so special? And the thing we forget is the thing this person articulated. And that was basically, but I want it from you.
Mm.
There's a way you do things that speaks to me that maybe these other people don't. And it was a nice reminder of, even though I'm not the only one doing what I do, take anything I do, all the different streams of income or whatever, take them all. There's other people doing those things. But there are people out there who want it from you because of who you are. And you connect with them in ways that other people don't or can't. That comment from this particular person I'm thinking about opened my eyes to that and freed me up to be more open to not holding back some of the things I was holding back on.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, building trust with listeners over episodes and them hearing your voice, and then it leads to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. That's cool to hear. All right, well, Jeff, as we close our episode today, you've been doing this for over a decade. You've coached numerous podcasters and business owners and helped launch, grow, and monetize podcasts. What's your best advice for a ministry leader that's wanting to start a podcast this year?
I'll hire me. No, my best advice would be to start with a clear mission and be consistent. Still, I find as I coach podcasters, they want to know what's the silver bullet, to success. The number one thing I tell people, and there's nothing sexy about it, it's consistency. It's showing up. As I've done for the better part of 11 years, I haven't missed an episode in 6.5 years, but I think that consistency is really, really important. When I say clear mission, stand for something. That's another thing I teach podcasters. Don't be afraid to draw a line in the sand in the intro of every episode you do and dare your listener to cross it. That's the journey you're going on together, or you're daring them to go on together. Say something that, is going to force people to pick sides, and that helps sort of eliminate the wishy-washy middle, right? And the beauty of that is the people who are for what you stand for, based on that line you've drawn, are going to keep listening to hear their own beliefs affirmed, right? But even people on the opposite end of the spectrum who heard that line drawn and went, wait a second, I don't believe that. You've been so steadfast and strong in your conviction that they're curious. And many of them, not all, but many of them are going to listen because they want to hear you defend what you believe, right?
Yeah.
And so it's important to understand that as part of articulating a clear mission and knowing how to do that, delivering value to your audience, and not being afraid to, you don't want to go hog wild on this, but not being afraid to, experiment with the way you format your podcast, try different things. And certainly, as we've talked about, invest in good equipment from the start to just ensure, professional quality as best you can.
Yeah. Well, Jeff, thank you so much for taking the time today to share your podcasting journey with my audience and getting to encourage us from your journey to ours. And I really appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. I had a lot of fun.
What a great conversation with Jeff. And he shared some great podcasting advice. Have a clear mission and be consistent. There are no silver bullets to success. Just continue showing up for your audience. You can listen to Read to Lead podcast with the link in the show notes. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Ministries That Podcast, produced by Sonomorphic. If you enjoyed today's episode, follow or subscribe to the podcast and share it with a friend. That's the best way to get the word out so together we can help more ministries grow and thrive through podcasting. Now come back in 2 weeks to hear my conversation with Jordan Rayner. He's a best-selling author, keynote speaker, and host of Mere Christians, a podcast where he has conversations about how the gospel influences the work of those of us who aren't pastors or religious professionals. Jordan and I are going to talk about the connection between podcasting and being an author and speaker, the community he's grown out of his podcast and books, and his time management method for producing a weekly podcast. Well, until next time, keep encouraging your audience as they follow Jesus.